I'm Virginia Eskin. When I played a piano recital recently at a brand new hall in Iceland, I was just thrilled with the acoustics. And so was the audience. It seemed like they'd just come to hear the hall as much as they'd come to hear our music. And it made me realize that all the great composers wrote with acoustics in mind. We're going to think about buildings today on a note to you. Throughout history, music has been heard mainly in cathedrals and then eventually all kinds of auditoriums and halls got built. And all of this seemed to have an enormous impact on the composers who were writing the music and, of course, the audience. And it all got us to thinking about different kinds of halls that would be linked to the kinds of music that we sort of take for granted, but then we don't ever sort of specifically step back and realize that some of the composers were maybe composing for a specific cathedral or a specific auditorium or a specific something in the round or in the square. And the pieces we've chosen today are all linked to specific buildings. And it's been a lot of fun putting the program together because you really get into the physics of music, you get into all kinds of numerology. And so we're going to break down what happens with specific pieces of music. And we know back in the medieval times, cathedrals had a very long reverberation time, and it could be as long as maybe 5 seconds. And we know that numbers or numerology and the symbolism of numbers played a crucial role in the church. And there were all kinds of reasons for that. During the Mass, the 4 extremities of the cross were sprinkled 3 times, and there would be 7 altars, while 12 priests would carry the cross 4 times through the church. And all of this would impact very much on a composer. And as the liturgy changed, that also had a big effect on the type of music that was required. We're going to lead off with perhaps one of the greatest works ever composed, and that would be the St. Matthew Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach. He composed it for his church, the Thomaskirche, which was built in Leipzig. And we're just going to play a little portion of it to just sort of set the flavor of what we're talking about here, this very dense quality. And then after we listen to a little bit of the music, I'll come back and we'll talk about some of the details that Bach had to deal with. That was just the beginning of the St. Matthew Passion by Bach, and it was performed by the Bach Collegium Japan. Masaki Suzuki was the conductor. A beautiful CD, by the way, and we chose it because of that very dense quality. And we know that around Bach's time, maybe a little bit earlier in the early Reformation, the church leaders realized that they had to change the acoustics of cathedrals because the spoken word was very, very important. And so they started introducing drapery and maybe long velvet hangings. And I noticed pulpits were built, like little bird cages on the sides of the pillars in a cathedral. And this was all meant to sort of dampen the echo. And it starts also the idea of turning cathedrals not exactly into concert halls, but the concept of going to hear great music starts to be planted at that time. And that's going to have profound impact on the architecture down the line. Let's listen now to another portion of Bach. This is from his B minor Mass. We chose it because there are some beautiful words. And since we've been talking about the acoustics and the spoken word, we thought we should have a little example of that. And this has some very beautiful reverberance. And of course, they've recorded it in a cathedral, so it's very authentic in that regard. This is just a portion from the B minor Mass of Bach. That was just a little portion of Bach's B minor Mass, the Domine Deus section. And it was a duet sung by Isabelle Poulenard and John Elwes, backed up by La Petite Bande with Gustav Leonhardt conducting. And we chose it because it had a wonderful kind of twoism quality. It starts off with 2 flutes, and then 2 voices come in, and the piece is in 2/4, and it plays to what we're going to be investigating today on the program, which is the architecture in music. And it's really fascinating when you start to think about how music is formed and then the building in which it's going to be heard. No wonder it has such an effect on us. Well, back in 1895, a man named Wallace Clement Sabine was called in to sort of fix an auditorium at Harvard, and apparently the acoustics were just impossible. And he was a professor at the university, and now we think of him as the father of modern acoustical science. But they had the idea that there was something terribly wrong because when people spoke in the auditorium, they couldn't be heard. So that was his first challenge. And he came in there and created all kinds of boxes and experiments, and he worked late at night when things were quiet. And there's a long story about how he defined what we now call the rate of decay. In other words, how things sort of die out. And that's very important because if a hall is built for speaking, or sometimes also for hearing music, it can't be too dry and it can't be too wet. And Sabine was the first to kind of isolate these issues. And he realized that the absorption of the room multiplied by the reverberation time should be a constant. And he used the Coriolanus Overture by Beethoven because it starts with these really long silences. And when you listen to it now, think of Sabine choosing Beethoven's piece, not for the beautiful music, but because it had all the rests. So here's the Coriolanus Overture by Beethoven. That was the Coriolanus Overture by Beethoven. It was played by the Czech Philharmonic with French Czech Wagner conducting. And we used it because in our exploration of architecture and acoustics, it's a perfect piece. And I mentioned how Sabine was using that piece. And what he wanted to really capture was the time in between the long notes in the very beginning, and then it comes at the end, the long silences. And if you stop and think why Beethoven's music is so dramatic, it's the rests. And that, of course, is one of the great ironies, because musicians are always so concerned with playing passionately or playing in a very, light and frivolous way or flowery or whatever they're trying to indicate in the music. And the real professionals know the power of the rest, because that's when you really own people. And Beethoven really understood it in his Coriolanus Overture, because those rests they're as important as the music. I'm Virginia Eskin, and we're having a good time thinking about architecture and music today on A Note to You, how buildings have had an effect on the music that we hear. If you have a comment, please write. The address is A Note to You, care of WGBH Radio, 125 Western Avenue, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. And the email address is anotetoyou@wgbh.org. A Note to You is made possible by the friends and alumni of Northeastern University. So we're exploring the impact that architecture and acoustics have on composers and vice versa. and it's a wonderful symbiosis. And I ran across a great quote by Dr. Leo Baranek, who's an architectural acoustician living in Cambridge, Mass. And he makes this great comment. If you have a copy of the old great halls and you copy them, you'll make a great new hall. And without those studies, you're just gambling on the acoustics, Dr. Baranek said. And this was in reference to a brand new hall that he's had something to do with in Tokyo. And it's turned out very well. And that's not always the case, because we know that there was a huge flap over the building of Lincoln Center. All sorts of people were brought in, and New York taxpayers were very upset over the money that was spent. They ripped out the seats, they put in new seats, then they ripped out this and put in that. And I remember George Zell, the great conductor of the Cleveland Symphony, when it was all said and done, and he was asked, and with bated breath, they said, "Well, what do you think about the new acoustics?" And he paused. He said, "Well, it's like a very old woman, and she's covered in scars and moles and pimples, and her hair isn't very good. And they took away one of the moles." And everybody was horrified, because they'd been thinking that finally the acoustics had been improved. So it's a big issue, and musicians are crucially involved, because when we're on a stage, we know that it sounds good or it doesn't, and we don't know why. Well, back in 1436, a brand new cathedral was going to be dedicated in Florence, and there's been a discussion about that and the connection to a motet recently. And it took about 140 years for the Duomo to be built, and Filippo Brunelleschi designed its final stages. And then along comes Guillaume Dufay, and he composed a motet that was going to be sung at the dedication of the cathedral. And the amazing thing is that today scholars have discovered that the dimensions of the motet mimic the structural proportions of the cathedral. Of course, physicists love this sort of thing, and so do mathematicians. Musicians are usually a little skeptical, but it's so tight that you can't really ignore the connection here. The relationship between the moving voices in the motet are supposed to be like the sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. And that's sort of a nice image. And the motet also has sectional proportions in the music, 6, 4, 2, and 3. And those mimic or echo the structural proportions of the cathedral. Because as I said before, there's so much numerology in the Middle Ages and even in the Gothic period. And it all makes sense that the music that was going to be sung and part of the service, why not have it be absolutely linked up to the rooms where it would all be sort of floating around? But then it turns out that the number 7 actually is the most important number. 7 was the number of the church, because it comes out of the Bible that wisdom hath builded her house, she hath hewn out her 7 pillars. So you get the idea that all these architects, stonemasons, composers, singers, they really had to know mathematics, and they had to have a very strong sense of proportion and also of how things were built. So now when you listen to it, imagine that you're standing in the beautiful Duomo, which is in Florence. It's the main building of the city of Florence. You can't escape it. It dominates the city to this day. Here it is, Dufay's Motet. We just heard Nuper Rosarum Flores, a motet by Dufay, sung by the Hilliard Ensemble. Well, we're going to leap from the 1400s up to 1820. And it turns out that London was a major musical center when it comes to architecture. I think because they had a terrible fire during the Regency period and a lot of halls got burned down. So that gave architects a great chance to rebuild. And they took a severe look at what was needed when it came to building auditoria, as it's called. And the next bit of music you're going to hear is by a man named Ludwig Spohr. And in looking at old programs of music that was performed in London, Weber, Mendelssohn, Liszt, and there's old Spohr. And Spohr crops up over and over and over. He even was played by none other than Clara Schumann. We know she was a severe critic. And in London, the King's Concert Room and the Argyll Rooms were being built. And Ludwig Spohr was invited to come along, and he had this piece that we're going to play a portion of performed in the new Argyll Room, and that became the later seat of the Royal Philharmonic Society. This, of course, was happening in other big cities. In America, in Chicago, there's Orchestra Hall, and there's Carnegie Hall, and in Boston we have Symphony Hall. And as I said early in the program, the shape has an enormous amount to do, whether it's a shoebox or in the round, or in some of the European halls, the audience is actually allowed to go in back of the stage. It's a little unnerving, I can tell you as a performer, to have people sitting behind you or sitting on the stage. That's even more scary because we're so used to being up on a stage and having it to ourselves. And there's a privacy about that. And then that's invaded when you have audience breathing down the back of your neck. So listen now to Spohr's finale from his Septet and imagine that you're in the Argyll Rooms in London in 1820. just a little portion of the finale from the Septet by Ludwig Spohr, and it was played by Midsummer's Music. It's a group located up in Wisconsin, I think, and they play in the summertime. We just wanted to have that flavor because we were talking about auditoriums and what a great center London was, and that music somehow just embodied the kind of pretty thing that you would hear if you went to the Argyle Room in 1820. Another composer who was very popular in London a little later was Verdi, and Queen Victoria was a big fan of his. And by then, Covent Garden had been built, and it was built in the shape of a horseshoe and really had neo-Baroque splendor inside. And I think that was so that when you went there, you could see, and you could also be seen. That was a big part of the opera experience. So let's listen to some Verdi and imagine that we're in the new Covent Garden, all dressed up, and everybody's looking at the stage, and they're also looking at each other. This is just a portion from the Overture to I Vespri Siciliani. That was the Overture to I Vespri Siciliani by Verdi, played by the Tokyo Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Roberto Paternostro. And we were imagining ourselves in the new Covent Garden back in 1900. It apparently had a fire and had to be rebuilt, and they rebuilt it exactly like the original one with an even bigger chandelier. And the growing middle class is starting to attend concerts. And of course, concerts have completely moved away from cathedrals. Now, going to concerts is a fact of life. And along in there, I should mention that salons were also a big fact of life in Europe, and people who could afford it had big salons where they had concerts held in their own house. So the idea of special acoustics, all of this is now a sort of a given. Well, back in about 1850, Richard Wagner had in mind to do a very grand opera cycle, and that, of course, turned out to be The Ring. And he had some new concepts along with the new ideas in music, and he wanted to combine myth and legend, and he wanted to put it in sort of unusual context. And he got the idea of maybe having the opera performed in a plain wooden building out in the middle of a meadow. And then at the end of it, he planned to burn everything down, the building, the meadow, the orchestra, and the score. And he was also involved with King Ludwig of Bavaria, who was a little mad himself. And it was lucky that he had Ludwig to back him up because he paid for some of these monumental ideas. And there's a great story told that during The Ring, Wagner spared no energy trying to create this colossus of land and water and gods, heroes, dwarfs, giants. And he persuaded some local gymnasts to try out for the Rhine Maidens swimming episode in the opera. And they didn't want to really use the swimming machines. And then apparently when Alberic disappeared into a cloud of steam, the musicians complained down in the pit that the steam was ruining their instruments, and also it was blinding them. They couldn't even see the music. And then the final blow was that the big dragon was ordered, and it came in sections from London at a very big cost of £500. And only half the dragon arrived, though, because the other half was shipped to the other Bayreuth in Lebanon instead of Bayreuth in Germany. So it must have been a hot time around the old opera when Wagner was in control. Listen to this portion from The Ring. It's Siegfried's death, and all the music that you'll hear is very spiritual sounding. You just imagine what's going on with all the musicians in the background. Here it is, Wagner's Siegfried's death scene from The Ring. That was Siegfried's Death portion from The Ring, the great opera cycle by Richard Wagner, played by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Daniel Barenboim was the conductor. And we're going to end out the program today on architecture and music with a section of the Great War Requiem by Benjamin Britten. And we liked all the aspects that are sort of wrapped up in this piece. It's homage to both World War I and II. It involves wonderful poetry by Wilfred Owen. And it also involves consecration of a major cathedral, which was St. Michael's back in Coventry in 1962. So it sort of plays into all of our hands. And we chose this section, which is the antiphonal part, where the boys' choir is singing at a distance, so you get that nice echoance. And Britten would have factored that in to his plan, because he knew, of course, the piece would be performed in the cathedral. So, and he would have been aware of all the reverberation and all the kind of quality that anything that's sung in a cathedral is naturally going to have, because it bounces off those stone walls, and that has a huge effect. It's not like a regular auditorium. Listen to the Libre Me section of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem.
Let us sleep now. Let us sleep now.
Just a portion of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, the Libre Me section. And I hope you've enjoyed our little sort of trip going to various cathedrals and auditoriums. And I would like to recommend a book if you're interested in the subject. It's published by MIT Press. It's called Buildings for Music by Michael Forsyth, and it is a wonderful read and has beautiful illustrations, and it's sort of written for the lay person. So I found it very fascinating, and I'll never play a concert without thinking of halls. Our engineer today has been Alan Mattis. Our producer is Alan McClellan. We've had help from Jane Matt, and I'm Virginia Eskin. A Note to You is made possible by the friends and alumni of Northeastern University. It's produced by Northeastern University in cooperation with WGBH Radio, Boston.